Probably the most important event that we are remembered for, the Cherokee, was that terrible forced removal from our mountain homelands. And like many native tribes, Cherokees have taken that history and woven it into a told story so that it will never be forgotten. I learned this story from one of our Eastern Band Cherokee brothers. The small group of Cherokees who were not removed up in the mountain fastness of North Carolina, they are still there. And of course, they are a federally recognized tribal nation in their own right. So this is a story I learned out east. In May of 1838, the storm that had been for so long gathering broke over the Cherokee Nation. Indian removal. The brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, but the architect was Andrew Jackson. Jackson had made his military reputation that launched him into the presidency on the backs of Indian people, Cherokees, Choctaws, fighting with him, first in the war against the Red Stick Creeks, and then again in the War of 1812. But Jackson, he knew the people of the southeastern states, and he knew they coveted our land. And so right after he was elected, he passed a law called the Indian Removal Bill, calling for all 5 of the southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, to sign treaties, give up their homelands, and move west beyond the Mississippi. And one by one, our neighbors, they gave Jackson a treaty. And one by one, they left. But the Cherokees refused. In the beginning days of the United States, George Washington and then Thomas Jefferson held out an olive branch to native peoples, saying, "Live more like we do." And the Cherokees accepted the challenge, and their country was transformed. Instead of the traditional village agriculture, great farms and plantations, businesses. There was a Cherokee newspaper using the brilliant syllabary, a way of writing in the Cherokee language that was developed by Sequoyah. And so by the time Andrew Jackson came into office and my great-great-great-grandfather, John Ross, was elected principal chief, the Cherokee Nation was a shining and prosperous land that was coveted by our neighbors in Georgia. You see, Georgia claimed a part of what was our nation for her own. And she was eager for a removal treaty to be signed with the Cherokees. Georgia passed a series of very restrictive laws claiming they applied to us in our own country. No Cherokee could own a gun. No Cherokee could testify in a court. All of these laws meant to dissolve our national identity. And there was horrible violence. Georgia pony soldiers riding across the border at night, beating Cherokee men, raping Cherokee women, burning Cherokee homes. And the Cherokees, they fought back. They didn't go to war. They went to court. And in a landmark Supreme Court decision, the court found on behalf of the Cherokee. The Cherokee are a domestic dependent nation with a government of their own, with an economy of their own, with borders of their own, and Georgia has no power over them. Whereupon Andrew Jackson became the only president in the history of the United States to openly defy the Supreme Court. He is said to have remarked, John Marshall has made his decision as Chief of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice. To the Georgians, he said, light a fire under them. They'll move. And so with the federal government refusing to uphold the terms of our treaties, the Georgian violence increased until finally one small faction of the Cherokees, they gave in. And they signed the treaty that Jackson wanted, the Treaty of New Echota, signed on December 29th, 1835. The Cherokees protested that the treaty was a fraud. It was not signed by any of the leaders who had the right to make such an agreement. But Jackson didn't care. He took it to the Senate, and there it was ratified by one vote. And when the grace period in the treaty had expired, and the Cherokees had still refused to move, the United States Army, led by General Winfield Scott, moved into Cherokee country, rounding up the families, herding them from their homes. All they were allowed to take was what they could carry on their backs. And they were herded into 7 great wooden stockades like cattle, and with inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate sanitation, the people began to fall sick. And in June of 1838, the first detachment of Cherokees were taken from a stockade and sent on their way west. Now, they were originally supposed to go by the river route on flatboats, but it had been a spring and a summer of drought, and the rivers were dry. So they walked, following the rivers. In the sickly season, the hot season, and weak from the months in the stockade, they began to die. First the very old, and then the very young. And after days and days of this torment, the hearts of the women broke. They walked as though they could see nothing ahead of them. They walked through the day, some of them carrying the bodies of their little ones because they refused to believe that they were gone. And when the end of the day came, they sat and they stared into a future too bleak to face. And the men, seeing their women, they became frightened, and so they gathered together and they went out in the night to pray. Unetlana, pity us, help us. The strength of the Cherokee people is the strength of our women. If they cannot survive, we will not survive. And they say that Creator took pity on those men and spoke to them, saying, in the morning, tell your women to look back at the trail they have watered with their tears. I will send them a sign. And so the next morning the men told the women what Creator had said, and they felt better. And they went about preparing for the day's march. And as they set foot on the trail, they looked behind them. And there, springing from the ground, were all these beautiful green vines weaving themselves together, stems with 7 leaves, one for each of the 7 clans of the Cherokee. And at the end of each of those stems, a beautiful little white flower. White, the Cherokee color for peace. But in the center of each of those flowers was a little circle of gold. So the Cherokees would never forget. It was greed that had taken them from their land. But seeing those beautiful little flowers growing back along the trail they had followed, springing from the earth, sprouting the leaves, bursting into bloom, the women remembered. As long as there is beauty in the world, there is hope. And so they found the strength to finish their journey. And Chief John Ross, horrified at the death toll mounting, he finally gave in. He went to General Winfield Scott and said, let the Cherokee manage their own removal. We will not go herded like a defeated people. We will move like the tribal nation that we are. And Winfield Scott agreed. And so the removal was halted through that summer while all things were made ready for them to undertake that journey. And the trail began again in September. But the worst winter ever recorded struck the Cherokees on the trail. And again, people began to die. But when we reached our new home, the Cherokees, as they had done so many times before, they rose from the ashes like the great bird, the phoenix. And once again, they stood tall. They stood proud. But we tell that story to remember the history and remember the most important thing. As long as there is beauty in the world, there is hope.